My name's John Foster. I'm a librarian at Manor Public Library. I have a doctorate in history from the University of Washington. Actually, my specialty is European history, and I probably know more about the history of East Germany than anybody you're likely ever to meet. Thinking back to October of 1962, on October 1st, Johnny Carson took over The Tonight Show on a permanent basis, which I had not known. On the Wednesday, October 3rd, Wally Schirra was launched into orbit. On October 4th, unbeknownst to a lot of people, first R-12 rocket was installed in Cuba. Now, there was some sort of inkling that this was happening at the time. We'll get down to sort of who knew what and at what point in a little bit. On the 5th of October, Dr. No premiered in the UK, the first James Bond movie. The thing that was really in the news, does anybody remember what the big news in the beginning of October? The war between India and China was kicking off, and people, if you read the headlines back then, that was what people thought. I mean, people were tense back then for reasons that are not hard to recreate, but which we will talk about in more depth. On October 14th, a U-2 spy plane flying over San Cristobal in Cuba saw evidence of missile installations, and things got going for real. So the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis comes at the kind of nexus of two histories that are connected. One is the Cold War, obviously, which came in the last days of October 1962, closer to becoming a hot war than it ever became at any other point. But also the history of the development of nuclear weapons. And these are sort of stations of the cross, if you will. Nuclear weapons began to be developed for real in 1942, and then we'll talk about some of the other sort of moments. The sort of early history of it, in a way, I mean, people had talked about, physicists had talked about the possibility of splitting atoms and stuff like that. H.G. Wells wrote a book in 1914 called The World Set Free, in which he speculated about the possibility of nuclear energy. And he was the first to use the term atomic weapons. He uses it in this book. This fellow is named Leo Szilard. He was a physicist educated in Hungary in what at the time that he was undertaking it was still the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was later chased out of Hungary, chased out of Eastern Europe, chased out of Europe really, by the rise of National Socialism. He moved to London. He was the one who came up with the idea of a nuclear chain reaction in the 1930s. In 1936, he patented a model for a nuclear reactor. This is a slightly later version. He patented it under the assignation of the British Admiralty to keep it secret. And it wasn't published, the actual patent for it wasn't published until 1949. There was a lot of skepticism toward what he was doing. He eventually ended up moving to the United States. He was one of the people involved in the Manhattan Project, which started in the basement of Pepin Hall at Columbia University, eventually expanded to a number of locations, Tennessee, the Hanford nuclear plant in southeastern Washington, which I grew up very near to, in fact, where the plutonium was made. There was another part of it that was actually just south of downtown Cleveland, and in fact, somebody, I'm trying to remember who told me this, but they keep trying to fully connect the towpath, and one reason that they can't do it is because there's a Superfund site left over from the development, the processing of uranium, which has still yet to be cleaned up. The Manhattan Project was basically, I mean, they had realized that it was possible to build a bomb and they wanted to be the first one to do it. They said that they were going to, there was sort of a parallel program going on in the UK, and Roosevelt had promised Churchill that they would sort of keep them up to date, which they didn't, much to Churchill's annoyance, because his scientists knew roughly what we were doing, but also were just not brought in on the briefings. One of the sort of central points of it once it moved out of the Columbia University was at Los Alamos, where a laboratory was built kind of out in the desert under the supervision of the nuclear scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer. By the way, in July, a movie about Oppenheimer is coming out. It looks really, really good. You can see the kind of, Oppenheimer was fascinated by the topic, but also really terrified because he knew exactly what sort of thing they were trying to build and what the sort of forces involved could actually do. This is the Trinity Bomb test conducted in the desert in New Mexico on July 16th, 1945. It's unclear exactly how much energy released. They think maybe on the order of, the low estimate is about 5 kilotons, the high estimate is between 15 and 19 kilotons. Oppenheimer, so there's a lot of sort of interesting stuff. Oppenheimer, once it went off, so one of the other scientists said, you know, he was kind of walking around with a kind of strut on because he realized that he had successfully like made real this thing which they had not been sure was actually could be done. But also Oppenheimer said later in an interview, Oppenheimer had been a student of Indian poetry, and he said that as he watched it, he thought of the moment in the Bhagavad Gita when Vishnu is trying to convince the Prince Arjun to do his duty, and he takes on his many-armed form, and he says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." And that's an indication of the gravity that he understood now, like the destructive power that was now open to human beings. And he really understood that it was going to be done, right? I mean, this is the thing that he really, that terrified him, is somebody was going to do it. Interestingly, I was in college, Edward Teller, who was the father of the hydrogen bomb, came and spoke. Everybody was like, "My God, why did you do that?" And Edward Teller is wholly unapologetic. It was like, well, somebody was going to do it. Why not us? And in that respect, he's not wrong. Right? If somebody's going to get the hydrogen bomb, why not us? Because you don't want to be the one left holding the bag without the hydrogen bomb if it comes down to that. So about a month later, they dropped the 2 bombs, first on Hiroshima, second on Nagasaki. Nagasaki was kind of second choice, and it was because I think they were going to drop it on Kuroda, but the weather was bad. And they kind of dropped it in the wrong place, not that it mattered much. The 2 bombs killed about 120,000 people, which seems like a lot, until you remember that the firebombing of Tokyo earlier in 1945 killed far more people than that. Probably 20,000 Japanese military personnel were killed. The vast majority of people in both those cities were not military age males. But, you know, and there's a debate, which we don't have to have here, and which you are all, I'm sure, aware of, about especially dropping the second one. There's an element of truth to the suggestion that the second one was dropped to show the Soviets that it wasn't just a one-off thing, that we could make another one. But my grandfather was in the process of being transferred from service in the European theater to the East, and I've been told in such a way as to believe it that up through the 1980s, they were still giving out Purple Hearts that had been minted in preparation for the invasion of Japan, because they thought they were going to use so many of them. So you make a state makes a sort of bargain with its soldiers, right? That it's not going to put you in harm's way if there's another way to do it. So, you know, was this a legitimate way to do it? That's a debate that continues. But a lot of Americans survived who mightn't otherwise. So there's many sides to it. By 1949, the Soviets had an atomic bomb. This is the Joe-1 atomic bomb, named for Joseph Stalin. Joe-1 is our name for it. The Soviet designation is RDS-1, or device number 501. It yielded about 21 kilotons. That's relatively still bigger than the Hiroshima or Nagasaki bombs, but still smaller than bombs to come. It was basically developed because the Russians had a spy, Klaus Fuchs, among the people working on the Manhattan Project.
It was Oppenheimer.
Well, Oppenheimer's, there's no proof that that's the case.
That's the general feeling.
Well, he was a leftist, and that's why. I mean, and he lost his security clearance for many years afterwards, too. I mean, Fuchs, they know, gave out secrets. So, but in any case, they got it. And there were a lot of people, though, and not just, you know, people on one side of the spectrum, saying that we should just give it to them because they were going to get it anyway. Mm-hmm. And that way, we don't look like we're trying to push them over the edge. So there's that argument to be made too. In any case, they got it. Somewhat alarmed by this, President Dwight Eisenhower gave what's called the Atoms for Peace speech in December 1953 in front of the UN, in which he basically said that what the United States wanted to do was to distribute nuclear technology around the world for peaceful purposes, for medical purposes, or what have you. There's some suspicion or some suggestion that the Israeli nuclear plant at Dimona was eventually built based on technology that was given over in the process of this. I don't think there's good evidence for that. I think they got the technology in other ways. They were definitely getting heavy water and stuff from the Norwegians. So, the reason why this is an issue, like, you know, is because proliferation of nuclear arms is a dangerous thing. So that's the other side of the coin of that argument about giving the Russians. Like, the more people that have it, the more people that are going to get it, and then you get down to people who are dumb enough to use it. I mean, I think if nothing else you can say about the Hiroshima Nagasaki, it really illustrated that it's a technology kind of too dangerous to use, for the reason that bombs are always indiscriminate. I mean, we can do more precision bombing than we used to be able to with laser-guided bombs now or whatever. But bombing in the way that it was done then, firebombing of cities, which we did in Japan, which we did to Dresden and to Hamburg, and which the Germans did too. I mean, this is not like, this was the kind of coin of the realm in those days. That it's indiscriminate. It doesn't pick out who it's going to wipe out. It just blows up whoever happens to be there, which makes I mean, in that respect, in a way, the atomic bomb is just a more extreme version of something we already had, right? I mean, you know, dropping a 3,000-pound bomb on a populated city means that probably the block it hits and the four around it are all going to be vaporized, and it's not going to be selective about who gets killed there. So I love this quote. So my country's purpose is to help us move out of the dark chambers of horror into the light. If you hear the speech is recorded, and I definitely recommend listening to it online, because it's really when, you know, Eisenhower had a reputation for not being like the most intellectual guy who was ever president. He was definitely a bright man, but every now and then he would uncork a speech that was really powerful, and this is one of them. I mean, because he really sort of coalesced the point of what the danger that humanity was facing was. This is Castle Bravo at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific. Gave us the word the Bikini. This is the first hydrogen bomb. It's a thermonuclear bomb. A thermonuclear bomb is different from an atomic bomb in that it utilizes the energy released when two atomic nuclei combine or fuse to form a heavier nucleus. An atomic bomb uses energy released when a heavy atomic nucleus splits or fissions into two lighter nuclei. I'm always struck, there's a quote at the bottom which you can't read, but which I will tell you. There's a documentary made in Great Britain about nuclear war in 1966 in which this line has always stuck with me. The blast wave from a thermonuclear explosion has been likened to an enormous door slamming in the depths of hell. Castle Bravo was meant to be about 5 megatons. It turned out that it yielded between 15 and 16 megatons. So it was about 2.5 times more powerful than they thought it was going to be. And it became obvious within the first few seconds that the explosion was much larger than they thought it was going to be. Sailors who were watching it could hold up their hand and see the bones of their hand because of the brightness of the light. The scientists, as it was happening, one of them said later that they realized that there was a small but not zero chance that it was going to light the atmosphere on fire. And they were really nervous that was going to happen. On the 30th of October 1961, the Russians created the largest man-made explosion in the history of man-made explosions, the so-called Tsar Bomb in Nova Zemlya in the very far northwestern corner of Russia. That's the crater. It's actually visible from space. This was a 50 megaton explosion, which is just an absolutely gigantic blast. It was dropped about a kilometer, and it spread so much radiation that after that too, partly after Bikini, the radiation spread so far from Bikini, from the Castle Bravo test, that they started talking about not doing atmospheric nuclear tests anymore because it was so ginormous, and because the radiation spread so far. And as they later discovered with Chernobyl, it's hard to, the radiation is no respecter of borders. The way that Chernobyl was originally discovered was that radiation detectors in Sweden started going off, and when you consider that Chernobyl is in Ukraine, that's a long way away. The Castle Bomb nuclear test was scheduled to coincide with the 22nd Congress of the Soviet Communist Party. Hell of a way to celebrate it. 1958 and 59. So this is really, in a lot of respects, the kind of high Cold War, right? So Stalin dies in 1953. Khrushchev becomes first secretary of the Communist Party. 1956, at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, he delivers what's referred to as the secret speech. So at the end of the party, at the end of the Congress, he gives this secret speech in which he says, Stalin did all these criminal things. Like, Stalin started this cult of personality. Stalin had all these people murdered. To which a lot of people said, well, where were you when this was going on, Nikita? I mean, a lot of people in the party were like, interesting. Like, by the way, like, of all the people running your branch of the party, only 4 survived, and you were one of them. Why was that? And it's because Khrushchev was very good at, or was pretty merciless as far as like giving people a push when they had to go. I mean, but he did, and it was a shocking thing. I mean, it was sort of meant to be secret, but then it was kind of leaked. When it was read to the head of the Polish Communist Party, who was in hospital for some other thing, he apparently was so struck that he died from shock, because it was basically just saying what everybody knew, right? I mean, there was anybody who wanted to know about the crimes of Stalin knew about them. There was no, there had been lots and lots of evidence about the great purges of the 1930s, about the famine that was engineered in the Ukraine that killed between 2 and 6 million people. There's no way of knowing exactly how many. And he was guilty of crimes that make Hitler sort of pale, although you don't want to compare things like that. I mean, the point is that each one was horrible in his own way. As the Cold War went on, or as the Cold War kind of developed, especially after 1949, both sides each side was very nervous about the other. I mean, the Western Allies, so to speak, or the United States, the U.S. government, let's just start out with, as early as 1943, had started having discussions about what the post-war world was going to be like and who the enemy was. By 43, they were convinced that the defeat of Nazi Germany was a when rather than an if. So then they started thinking, well, what's going to be up in the post-war world? The Soviet Union, Stalin particularly, as the war sort of came to an end, wanted to create a series of buffer states because they'd been invaded several times since 1800 and they didn't want it happening again. And I mean, Stalin, one of the things that he did was essentially move Poland about 200 miles to the west. So he took the eastern 200 miles of Poland and he gave Poland German territory, what had been German territory up to what was called the Oder-Neisse line. By the way, and this tells you all you need to know about Stalin. Many of you have heard me tell this story before, that at the Potsdam Conference, Churchill raised the question of the treatment of Catholics in Eastern Poland and that the Pope was upset about it. To which Stalin replied, "The Pope? How many divisions does he have?" And that tells you really what you need to know about how Stalin viewed things. Like I have several hundred divisions, and if you want to, if you have a problem with what I'm doing, that's what you're going to have to deal with. But by the time Khrushchev became, historians have sort of settled on the idea. So one of the things that the North Atlantic powers were very nervous about was the fact that the Russians, if they'd wanted to, could have been at the English Channel in about a week. In fact, and historians have really settled on this, like there's a lot of literature about it, on it, which I invite you to read if you're interested, that the Soviets really didn't want to do this. They had plans to do it, right? We have plans to invade and militarily occupy Canada. Doesn't mean we're going to do it. It means that you have to plan for every contingency in military planning. I've told this to my friend in Canada, and he was like, well, why would you want to do that? And I'm like, well, we don't. But we might have to. I mean, that's just how it is. But there was a lot of tension, and it was elevated somewhat in 1958 and 59 when the United States put Jupiter missiles first in Italy and then in Turkey. So this is right on the border of the Soviet Union, roughly speaking. Turkey is very close to it, or what was in those days the Soviet Union. And they were not like terribly cagey about it. Well, that's Cuba. We'll get to that in a minute. That's a Jupiter missile site. That's a Jupiter missile site in the United States, not in Turkey, but just take it as read that that's where they put them. And this was part of the kind of mounting tension between the two sides. And you can see why this constitutes a sort of rise in the aggregate level of tension, right? Because it's, the Soviets had kind of gotten used to thinking, well, if the Western imperialists want to invade us, right, they got to go through Eastern Germany and Poland or Romania or Bulgaria. We have this like buffer that they would have to go through to get to us. But no longer. A Jupiter missile can reach most places in Western Russia, including most of the major command and control systems. A Jupiter missile is, as I understand it, and there are people who might understand this, but it's essentially this kind of land-based version of a Polaris missile. It can go a long way. And putting it in, it didn't have to go that long away if you're going to put it in Turkey. Putting it in Turkey is a provocative, it was still under US control. This was like not quite, the later sort of NATO move of putting missiles like in Germany. That happened a little sort of further down the trail. And this is also not quite, one of the innovations that Ronald Reagan brought was that he basically decided they can't possibly pay for as much military hardware as we can. So if we keep making more, eventually we'll cause their economy to collapse, which is in a lot of respects what happened. But that also is once again a kind of later step in the process. Closer to home, there's Cuba. Cuba in the 1950s was a kind of gangster's paradise. It was run by Fulgencio Batista, who's a former military officer. My theory of government really is that you can either be incompetent or a brute, but if you're both, chances are you're going to hit the rocks. And that was Batista's problem. His government was not what you'd call democratic and employed death squads that probably killed about 20,000 of his own citizens, some of whom were probably communists, many of whom were probably not. He was connected with the mob. Cuba was a sort of like vacation paradise for people with money to spend. But probably in the 1950s, something like 40% of Cuban children were malnourished, and rising to 60% outside of the cities. And so he was a sort of a kind of left-wing movement got going. One of the original sort of leaders is Fidel Castro. There he is after he'd gotten arrested for trying to seize the Moncada barracks in 1953. This was a harebrained scheme for which most of the people involved were arrested and shot. As a matter of fact, the officer, Castro was arrested. Castro was from a reasonably good family, actually. He was arrested, and he was very surprised to find that he was not immediately put up against the wall and shot. And he asked the officer in charge, like, why is there going back to wherever he's going to be in jail? He said, why didn't you have me shot? And he said, muchacho, I'm just not that kind of guy. Might have been better if he'd had, viewed in a certain way, given what happened later in Cuba. Eventually, Castro is released. He makes his way into exile. He puts together a ragtag group. He becomes a Marxist in prison. Castro had about his understanding, his understanding of Marxism was about like certain American politicians' understanding of Christianity. We can hold up the book, but we don't necessarily know all that much about what's in it. And I think that was really mostly true of Castro. He wasn't a very doctrinaire Marxist, although some of the other people with him were, especially Che Guevara, who I don't think is in any of these pictures, weirdly enough, but Che Guevara was a doctor from Argentina who was a very convinced Marxist and actually knew something about it. But in any case, they start this revolution in the Sierra Maestra down on the south coast of Cuba, and through a combination of a really remarkable ability to live in personal discomfort and the incompetence of the regime, managed by 1959 to depose Batista. And things are actually going pretty well. I think he was Times Man of the Year in 1959, Castro was. But then, as often happens with these things, first of all, they start nationalizing a lot of companies, many of which are owned by Americans. That's usually a way to an unfortunate end. This is what happened 1956 in Argentina or in Guatemala when the Arbenz government started nationalizing the property of United Fruit. Similar things start happening in Cuba. The U.S. government gets a lot less happy about Castro being in power. Mostly the U.S. government doesn't really care what goes on in Cuba. I mean, they don't have like a very strong emotional connection to Batista. This is before the sort of Miami Cubans. That's a kind of a later thing, although the two things are connected, as I'm sure you can gather. But so they also start shooting people, which is, gives things a sort of an ugly turn. And Castro becomes convinced that the U.S. wants to depose him, which they do. So under Dwight Eisenhower's government, the CIA starts putting together a kind of a plan where they're going to have refugee Cubans, if you will, invade the country. Their idea is everyone hates communism. The population will rise. We'll put these couple hundred guys on the beach, and the people will rise to their banners or whatever. It was a kind of a clunky operation, partly because it comprised not only people who were partisans of Batista, but people who had hated Batista, but also hated communism, which was sort of, there was a pretty significant opposition to Batista, like non-communist opposition to Batista, because he was a thug. So there was that, and there was also not very good, I mean, the whole thing was poorly done. And this results in the Bay of Pigs, which happens shortly into John F. Kennedy's time as president. Kennedy was after Kennedy became president, he was sort of informed about this plan. It had been sort of put together under Eisenhower. Kennedy was very worried about being seen to be soft on communism. He had met with Khrushchev. Khrushchev kind of bullied him. Khrushchev was a kind of a goon, too. I mean, he was a sort of a yokel, in a way, a kind of Ukrainian yokel. There's that sort of famous scene of him like pounding the desk with his shoe. And he liked the fact that he could push Kennedy around. So Kennedy was feeling a little tender about that. Kennedy had also run on the proposition that there was a missile gap, that the Soviets had like large amount more missiles than we did, which is just fundamentally not true. We had at least 4-1, and they didn't have we had sort of the beginnings of ICBMs, which they didn't have until much later. But lots of people believed it. So anyway, the Bay of Pigs, or the Playa Giron, happens. It's a catastrophic failure. The population, many of them don't like communism, not surprisingly, but many of them are not thrilled with the idea of Batista or someone like him coming back either, which is why, and this is sort of before Castro became really unpopular, or rather less popular, let's just say. So there was really not an upsurge of popular support for this when it happened. And these are Cuban forces heading toward the beach. Most of the people were arrested. Many of them were shot. And the thing was a complete fiasco. And it was, for Kennedy, it was kind of go ahead, yes?
I was there.
Really?
Yes. I was due to hit the beach as a fleet marine. I was in the Navy.
Oh, yeah.
And they were training us to, we had one Marine per squad.
Right.
And we had 45 Marines on our ship. But, at the last minute, Kennedy pulled the plug on it. We were to give them air cover.
Right.
To give them, the artillery cover from
right.
ships. And he just backed out on it, and they dumped him on the shore and left him. Yeah,
that's pretty much what happened. It turned out that well, it's a complicated thing, but that's not an unfair statement of what happened. And in fact, what we ended up with was the worst of both worlds. That is to say, we did this thing, it turned out to be a fiasco, and then Kennedy ends up looking worse than he would have if he just sort of said, let's not do this. Partly, Kennedy wasn't into the idea of like Americans getting killed, which he thought might happen, but in for a dime, in for a dollar. Like, if you're going to do it, it can't have only occurred to him then that was a possible, or it shouldn't have, that was a possible outcome. So by this time, Castro is in full paranoia mode that the United States wants to overthrow his government because they've just tried. Also, the CIA came up with a whole bunch of plans about what they were going to do. They were going to assassinate Castro. They were going to poison his cigars so his beard would fall out, and this would like lead people not to sort of trust in his masculinity or what have you. But clearly, you know, the U.S. government regarded a communist state 60 miles off the coast of Florida as not an ideal situation, even though we had a naval base there. You know, which Castro was like, the naval base is illegal. To which the United States government was like, yeah, what are you going to do about it? Like, it's there. At this point, the Russians concoct the idea, Khrushchev particularly, gets the idea of wanting to locate missiles in Cuba. And he wants to do it for several reasons. One is because of the Jupiter missiles in Turkey and in Italy. You know, he thinks, well, if they're going to have missiles on my doorstep, I'm going to put missiles on their doorstep and we'll see how they like it. Also, he's kind of gotten teased, if you will, or hassled by Castro about insufficient communist brotherliness, right? And he's afraid that Castro is going to get closer to the Chinese. You know, we tend to think, and not quite so much anymore, but at the time, of the communist world as being a sort of like one indivisible block, which it wasn't. I mean, they were all for communism, but like the Russians and the Chinese didn't play very well together and came to blows on several occasions. And the Russians sort of viewed certain people as their partisans. The Chinese viewed certain people as their partisans. This is why, you know, although there was Russian contributions to the Vietnamese communists, that was mainly a Chinese thing. Interestingly enough, because the one thing that Vietnamese people are most worried about is China renewing their claim that Vietnam is a southern part of China. I'm trying to remember, I think it was Pham Van Dong, one of the Vietnamese communist higher-ups said that the thing about Chou En-lai that you always had to remember was that he was always willing to fight to the last Vietnamese. So the Vietnamese often were like kind of looking to the Russians like, can you counterbalance maybe? But anyway, Khrushchev didn't want Castro moving toward the Chinese. 1962, Francis Gary Powers is shot down over the Soviet Union in a U-2 spy plane. He was supposed to commit suicide. They gave him suicide pills, but he didn't take it. He had been an Air Force pilot. He had retired from the Air Force and gotten hired by the CIA. At this point, the CIA was running the U-2 program. Later on, actually, by 1961, the Air Force had retaken over the U-2 program. And the reason was because they realized that the Russians now had surface-to-air missiles that could actually shoot down a U-2. Before, the U-2 flew at such an altitude that the Russian surface-to-air batteries couldn't hit them. Interestingly enough, the SA-2 Russian battery didn't just fire one missile, it fired about 14. And in fact, when they shot Powers down, they also shot down one of their own MiGs because it was the closest thing to a sort of shotgun type solution you can see at that altitude. But this was an embarrassment. Although interestingly, Khrushchev sort of tried to use it to embarrass Eisenhower. They were just about to have a conference in Paris, and Eisenhower said, yeah, he was our guy. We flew a spy plane over you guys. We spy on each other, that's what happens. And it kind of, Khrushchev kind of spoiled the conference, but Eisenhower basically just said, won the point by kind of telling the truth. You spy on us, we spy on you. By the way, we're flying these planes over you. Eisenhower, I think, is a very underrated president in the sense that he didn't send U.S. troops to places when he didn't need to. Almost never. Actually, if you read Robert Gates's book, he's a big fan of Eisenhower because Eisenhower got things done without like sticking a whole bunch of U.S. troops in a place where people hate them. And Eisenhower was accomplished a lot of things in terms of, like, for instance, getting rid of the communist government in Guatemala. He didn't send any troops there. He just got the locals to do it. And this is really the sort of, but by the same token, Eisenhower knew how to deal with Khrushchev, which was, we'll just tell you the truth. And what are you going to do about it? And there's, I think, a kind of brilliant strategy there. 1962, the Russians only really have about 20 ICBMs. They wouldn't really get their sort of serious ICBM fleet going until after 1965. So they really only have medium-range missiles. This is another reason why they want to put missiles in Cuba. Now you can, I think I have a map here. This is what we knew about the range of Russian missiles. This is the range of an IL-28. That's the range of an SS-4. That's the range of an SS-5. So basically, unless you're living in Washington or Oregon, that constitutes a direct threat. So Khrushchev is wanting to kind of, what he described as level the playing field. As early as the end of August 1962, the US was aware that something like this was going on. Charles Keating, the Republican senator, basically said so on the floor of the Senate. It's unclear where he got his information. Some people think it was Claire Booth Luce. The West German ambassador also, it turned out, knew, because he had been told by Cuban dissidents in Cuba that it was happening. Yes?
I was there.
Which there?
August 10th of 62.
Right.
I was on the Lake Champlain. It was an anti-submarine carrier. We had all prop aircraft, and we had S2F trackers, which had a crew of 4, and they patrolled, loaded with electronic gear for hunting Russian subs. We'd been to Kingston, Jamaica, and left there on the 8th, and it was Jamaica's independence.
Right.
And we left on the morning of the 9th. We went to Guantanamo Bay. It's my 9th time in Guantanamo Bay, and it's the first time we spent a night. The only time I ever went ashore. But we left there on the 10th. We're cruising through the Cat Island Passage of the Bahamas, and our planes were out. We were tipped off. There was a Russian spy, a colonel, that had decided to give us information. He ended up being a spy for the U.S. And he advised us that, a ship with missiles had left Russia, is heading to Cuba. One of our planes spotted the Russian freighter coming through the Cat Island Passage, and he took pictures of the freighter, brought them back to our ship. I was a photographer, and I didn't develop the picture. A fellow by the name of Anthony Bertoli developed the picture. I was outside the dark room with another fellow, and he brought the picture out. It was still wet, and he's holding it up, showed all these long tubes going down the deck of this freighter. Chief of the lab came in from behind me, looked over my shoulder, and he, no, that's not the way. The missiles went the other way. That's not the first missiles going in.
Well, the U.S. Air Force seems to think so.
Well, the Navy spotted it.
Right.
And the chief took the picture and ran it up to combat information, and we ended up going on an intercept with the freighter, and they're steaming along, and we came in at about a 30-degree angle. I knew something was going on because we got feedback from the CIA, combat information, and they called general quarters. Everybody went into the like there's an atomic attack. Nobody was on deck. Well, I didn't really have it's going to sound like a bunch of baloney, but this is gospel. I decided I'm going to see what's going on, and our photo lab was done on the hangar deck. Took an escalator up to the flight deck, across the flight deck, went into the port side, catwalks down into a gun tub that sticks about 30 feet out, the actual hull of the ship. And I was there as we come along. Our captain kept blowing his horn for them to turn. By international law, they have to turn. out of the way of a operating naval vessel, and they refused to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And at the very last moment, our ship swung alongside the freighter. I could have shook hands with the captain who was out on the flying bridge, and it ended up, I was overhanging the deck of this freighter.
Mm-hmm.
I could have actually spit down onto the missiles. When we left there, we got back to our home port. I was due to get discharged.
Mm-hmm.
The following Monday, we hit there on a Friday, and when I went to leave the ship, they knew who it was because I worked the flight deck. I was the only photographer that actually worked the flight deck. Everyone on the flight deck is color coded. You have red for fueling, yellow for the plane directors, and you have green for cat and so forth. Well, my shirt was green, but I had a black stripe down my back. So I went trotting across the flight deck. They knew exactly who it was. And when I went to check out, they told me, he says, don't talk to anybody about what you saw, because the FBI is going to be watching you. So.
Interesting.
So that goes all the way back to August 10th. In the meantime, we went on a 4-hour recall once we hit port, and which is the only time we ever did it. And between August and October, Cuba became an armed camp. We were ready to invade Cuba. I don't know how that fits into your program, but
Right. If they knew, they didn't tell them, because for the reason that, like, if a senator is giving out information like that in public, he probably hasn't gotten it from the Naval Department, I would guess.
that went to the CIA.
Right. But Keating is talking about it in public on the 24th of August, and really the question is how he knew. But in any case, Kennedy then has to do something about it. At that point, too, U-2 flights had been suspended over Cuba. So the U-2 flights didn't start again until October 14th. U-2 had crossed over Sakhalin Island. The Russians had protested, and the U.S. government had apologized. And then a U-2 being operated by the Taiwanese crashed in China. And so the United States government stopped doing U-2 flights for a period from the beginning of October until about the 14th of October. On the 14th of October, they do a U-2 flight that takes these pictures. You kind of can't see, but these are tents. These are the missile trailers. Once again, these are missile dollies. Guideline missiles, those are the surface-to-air missiles, which are there to defend the missile sites. At that point, Kennedy knows he has to do something, so he calls into being what's called the XCom, which is all of his sort of military and civilian advisors. You can see in here McNamara, the defense secretary, Dean Rusk. He also, unbeknownst to any of them, tape recorded all their sessions. And if you're interested in exactly what was being said in the course of these discussions, there's a book by a guy named Philip Zelikow who has transcribed a lot of the tapes, and you can hear a lot of what was going on. The U.S. military had, by this time, a very developed plan for invading Cuba. So their idea was, we've got to invade, we'll have airstrikes and we'll have an invasion. He was presented with 6 options, basically, by the military leaders, by Curtis LeMay, who was the head of the Air Force at that time, and by his civilian advisors. Some people said, well, we just don't do anything, because our vulnerability to missiles isn't a new situation. Some people said, we'll use diplomatic pressure to get the Soviets to pull the missiles out. Some people said, we should just go to Castro and say, in a sort of back channel, either get rid of the missiles or we'll invade. Some people said, let's just straight up invade. Some people said, and this I think was the first sort of suggestion that LeMay made, although I think LeMay came around to the full-scale invasion as the discussion went on, that we would just have the U.S. Air Force destroy all the known missile sites. And then finally, the idea was mooted that they would have a blockade to prevent more missiles from arriving in Cuba. The Joint Chiefs were very much on the sort of idea of full-scale invasion. Kennedy was not, and most of his civilian advisors, although not all, were not down for that idea for a couple of reasons. One was the possibility that it could start off a nuclear exchange. Another was that it would cause the Russians then to immediately seize Berlin, which they could do quite easily given the amount of troops that they had in Poland at the time. And so you get this sort of like period starting on October 21st, in which the Joint Chiefs are saying, you know, we need to have this invasion, in which Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, says, let's try a blockade. We'll see if that can resolve the situation. Now, of course, blockade is problematic. Why? Because a blockade is an act of war. And what they're trying to do is, in a very tense situation in which both sides have nuclear weapons, avoid the situation in which a nuclear exchange gets going. Because even though the Soviets only have about 20 ICBMs, that's enough to do considerable damage. So the Chief of Naval Operations wrote a paper in which he said, we're not going to blockade Cuba. We're going to quarantine them. What's the difference? Quarantine is not an act of war. Blockade isn't. And the language makes a kind of a difference. So now, after the, you know, in the 21st of October, you have this sort of policy emerging, which is, we're going to try, we have to get the missiles out of Cuba. We just, you know, everybody came around to the idea, we can't live with SS-5s in Cuba. That's too dangerous to the United States. And it puts Cuba in a position of having leverage over us that that's not acceptable. Especially since they also have SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missiles. And in the later stages of this, I think on the 26th, they ended up shooting down a US U-2 spy plane, killing the pilot. And in a way, it was the shooting down of that spy plane that kind of diffused the tension, because at that point, everybody's like, oh my God, somebody just got killed here. Like, this is just, because before that, I mean, what the US Navy did when it started the blockade, it picked a couple of ships that it didn't think were going to be full of Soviet personnel and stopped them just to make the point to the Russians, this is what we're going to do. And this is what we're willing to do. This is the blockade is for real. We're going to stop ships. We're going to search them. We're not going to let you send any more military hardware to Cuba than is already there. On the 23rd of October, Kennedy signs the order for the blockade. Here's, by the way, Kennedy meeting with Curtis LeMay and some of the other Air Force officers in his staff to discuss. LeMay was a very strong proponent of strategic bombing. I mean, he was the sort of, in a way, he was a kind of American version of Arthur Bomber Harris, the British Bomber Command. He really felt like, you know, anything that we wanted to achieve could be achieved via the use of strategic bombing. And, you know, there were a number of people in Kennedy's cabinet who really believed this. Kennedy, I think, if you want to look at it this way, took the kind of larger view, which is that the danger is so great. And, you know, he eventually ends up saying this. There's an exchange of letters between Kennedy and Khrushchev in which they both acknowledge the possibility for, like, worldwide Armageddon on the basis of this. Kennedy gives a speech on 7 o'clock Eastern Time, October 27. It should be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring full retaliatory response against the Soviet Union. So then he lays out in very stark terms, this is what it is. If the Cubans launch, it's not just going to be them. It's going to be you. It's going to be you too. To halt this offensive buildup in Cuba, a strict quarantine on all, quarantine, right? He does not say blockade, he says quarantine. On all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. This quarantine will be extended, if needed, to other types of cargo and carriers. We are not at this time, however, denying the necessities of life, as the Soviets attempted to do in their Berlin blockade of 1948. Okay, so once again, he's stating the American position, but he's also saying, like, look, this isn't the thing that required the Luftbrücke, 1948. This is us just saying you can't put any more more weapons. One of the immediate responses was that the Chinese said that they had 650 million Chinese men and women standing ready to defend the Cuban people. But Khrushchev, by this point, seems to have understood that he had overplayed his hand, that the United States really viewed Cuba as a kind of step too far. And you could look at it and say, well, you have missiles in Turkey, why can't we have missiles in Cuba? But the fact of the matter is that the US government had the capacity to blockade Cuba in a way that the Russians didn't have to blockade Turkey, so to speak. Khrushchev, in public, on October 24th, accused the United States of outright piracy. But that's just words. He, of course, has to say this. Khrushchev, at this point in back channel, starts working toward a diplomatic compromise because he realizes that he's got himself in an unwillable situation. He's not willing to go to war over Cuba, right? But what he needs from the United States is some sort of concession so it doesn't look like he's straight backing down. I mean, this is, the thing you have to understand about Khrushchev is that he's come up in a totalitarian system where losing face is often the first step to losing other parts of your anatomy. So he knows that, and his grip on power is tenuous. He's only really in power for 3 more years after this, like 64, if I'm not mistaken, is when Khrushchev is moved aside in favor of not anyone very much more prepossessing, but that's another issue. On the 25th, there's a confrontation between Adlai Stevenson at the UN and the Soviet ambassador Valerian Zorin. At this point, U.S. starts to put Strategic Air Command bombers on airborne alert, which means that 1/8 of the bomber fleet is aloft at any time, ready to launch some sort of counterstrike. And it redeployed 161 nuclear-armed interceptors to areas in the quadrant where they could respond to an attack. 23 nuclear-armed B-52s were sent into orbit points within striking distance of the Soviet Union. So this is for real stuff. And, people who lived through it will remember that the U.S. made it clear that what length they were willing to go to resolve the situation. According to one estimate, about 80% of Strategic Air Command's planes were ready to launch in the case that the crisis took the next step. At 7:15 on October 25th, the USS Essex and the USS Gearing attempt to intercept the Bucharest, but fail to do so. They're fairly certain that it's a tanker and it doesn't contain any military material. Later that day, the commander of the blockade ordered the USS Joseph B. Kennedy Jr. to intercept and board the Lebanese freighter Marukla. They board it, they check the cargo, it's cleared to go through. But this is the point. This is them making the point to the Soviets. Like, this is a for real thing. We're not just sitting out there on the waves like, whatever, we're going to board you. On October 25th, it becomes clear that the missiles are still being worked on and that the Soviets are still interested in trying to run the blockade. On October 24th, the Kislovsk, a Soviet cargo ship, is reported off the Cuban coast outside the blockade zone, but then is reported to have turned back. So this is the Russians on the 24th, on the 25th, realizing that, or kind of blinking, right? That they're not gonna try and for sure run the blockade. Starting on the 26th, secret negotiations start taking place between the U.S. government. Once again, this is a thing that, people ask, like, why does this stuff take place in secret? And the reason is because it's a lot easier to, moot ideas about things that might happen in secret than it is to argue about it in the newspapers. And once again, Khrushchev makes the point that he needs some kind of quid pro quo. He can't just straight back down. because then he loses credibility in the communist world. And the communist world is not, there's a sort of competition going on between the Russians and the Chinese for who's going to be the sort of leading power. It looks as if the Chinese won. But they're always playing the long game. I mean, there's that sort of, they asked, I think it was it Zhou Enlai, like, what he thought of the American Civil War? And he was like, well, it's too soon to tell. And this was in 1970. It's unclear whether that's a true story, but but it tells you something I think important about the way the Chinese think about politics. Khrushchev sends a letter to Kennedy. Mr. President, you and I ought not now to pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war. You have tied it. Because the more the two of us pull, the tighter the knot will be tied. And a moment may come when that knot will be tied so tight that even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it, and it will be necessary to cut that knot. And what that would mean is not for me to explain to you, because you yourself understand perfectly of what terrible forces our countries dispose. Consequently, if there is no intention to tighten the knot, and thereby to doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the ends of the rope, let us take measures to untie that knot. We are ready for this. So this is Khrushchev saying, like, okay, we need to talk. And what they finally decide is, the Russians say, okay, we will pull the missiles out of Cuba. Okay, fair enough. We've heard the point that you're making by mobilizing your bomber force, by putting Cuba in quarantine. What can be the quid pro quo? And Kennedy, the administration, Kennedy in particular, decide that they will agree to take the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey. Now you look at this and you're like, wow, that's it's trade. It's not really a trade so much in the sense that we still have lots of things that can hit the Soviet Union. And we still have a significant warhead superiority. I think the warhead superiority was 4-1, which warhead is different than the conveyance of getting it there, right? But we still have significantly more warheads than they do. So we can afford to be magnanimous in this because we don't want a nuclear war. And this, I think, is, there's a lot of debate about how Kennedy handled this. There's a lot of debate about, if we had invaded Cuba, what would the consequences be? Would the Russians have been willing to launch on that basis? Would we have just gotten rid of Castro? That probably wouldn't have been such a bad thing because he's a terrible guy. I mean, and not just like on perfectly objective terms. I think even a lot of Cubans thought so. A lot of people in the sort of wake of it looked at it and were like, oh, the Joint Chiefs, like what a bunch of, warmongering, whatever. Well, okay, but Cuba's, it's not sort of by accident that this is happening in Cuba, right? This is not like just sort of one of those things. Castro really has a very pronounced negative attitude toward the United States, not, without some kind of reasons. But the fact of the matter is, like, there is a case to be made to say that invading Cuba at that point doesn't obviously get us a bad outcome. That having been said, you have to kind of look at what people knew in the moment and what they were willing to risk. And if you're Kennedy, you're in the position that Oppenheimer is in the desert in 1945. Do you really want to be the person who is sort of responsible in some meaningful sense for the start of a global thermonuclear war? And I think Kennedy, especially if you look at Kennedy didn't survive to say anything about it. Kennedy is practically the only person who lived through it who didn't have anything to say about it, and that was because he was assassinated in 1963. But practically everybody else, Dean Rusk and Robert McNamara and all the military people, Khrushchev, everybody has written about what they thought about. And in that moment, they got to a point where they realized that they were really right on the verge of an actual nuclear war. And the downside of a nuclear war is, and a lot of the scientists knew this, it wasn't, I think, clear to everybody, is that it is unwinnable. I mean, interestingly, for those of you who use the internet was sort of originally developed as a way for like US command and control to survive a nuclear strike. But Kennedy, I think, pretty clearly decides, and Khrushchev decides, a nuclear exchange is not a winnable exchange, so we have to find some way of getting out of it. Now, they had taken themselves to the brink. They were as close as we ever came in that period to a civilization-destroying nuclear exchange. And you know, you people who all lived through it will remember, because everybody knew it. It wasn't, you know, people in the military knew it. People out on the street knew it. This is a very dangerous situation that Kennedy managed to get us through without killing everybody, which, you know, and whatever you think about Kennedy, you know, he managed to get the missiles out of Cuba without sparking a thermonuclear exchange, which you know. And the same way about Khrushchev. Now, does that mean Khrushchev was a great guy? No, it does not. Does that mean Khrushchev, in the moment, could manage to like pull back from like, you know, instigating a nuclear exchange over Cuba? Yeah, he could. So you got to give him credit for that, right? But there's a certain point in which civilian negotiation has to be the coin of the realm. Like at a certain point, like the you know, we're ready to go to the brink, right? Because we can't, like SS5s, SS4s in Cuba is a non-starter. Like that's a clear and present danger to the United States that has to be addressed. And ultimately, Kennedy managed to get it done. But he managed to get it done in a way that really, I think, changed the way people thought about the world that they were living in ever since then. And I can only tell you from, you know, living in the 1970s, when everybody still talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis, when it was still a reality, when, you know, my cousin who was in the Navy was serving with guys in San Diego who'd been in roughly the same position that you were, and we're just like, we're ready to do their duty in the moment, but also we're alive to the danger that the situation, you know, and the fear that there was no outcome. You know, this is, at a certain point, I think it's Omar Bradley says at the end of the Second World War, like, you know, after the bombs that dropped on Hiroshima Nagasaki, you know, we've gotten to this point where our technology has outstripped our capacity for moral reasoning. And if it doesn't catch up, we're going to be in a bad situation. And is this evidence that it had caught up? That's for you to decide, really. But what I do think is it's a nexus moment in the Cold War, after which we never quite get that close to blowing the doors off of things. And, you know, maybe the ultimate point is that maybe we did have a kind of capacity to learn. I mean, the Soviet system is obviously a repugnant system, but they went about things in a different way after that. In a lot of respects, no less brutal, but not as likely to spark off global thermonuclear war, which I think is probably a step forward. In the same way, the United States then takes a kind of different attitude toward the Soviet Union up through, I mean, first of all, you get Nixon like going to China and sort of taking advantage of the divisions between the Russians and the Chinese. Like, because then the Russians were like, hey, what the hell? Why are you guys meeting with Nixon? The Chinese were like, forget you, bud. We don't like you. What begins now, too, is the sclerosis of the Soviet system. Like when basically, I mean, this is, if you want to call this the brilliance of Ronald Reagan, because he was just like, why do we have to bomb you into submission? We'll just spend you into submission. And that was ultimately what happened. I mean, eventually, Gorbachev can't paper over the credit. I'll finish with this joke. Lenin, Stalin, and Brezhnev are all on a train, and the train breaks down. And they're like, well, what are we going to do? And Lenin says, well, clearly the train crew needs to be re-educated. So they conduct classes in Marxism, Leninism, and eventually the train gets going again. Gets down, a few miles further down the track, and it stops again, and they sit around trying what to do. And Stalin says, well, clearly the train crew are counter-revolutionary and need to be purged. So they take the train crew out and they have them shot, and they get a new train crew in, and the train starts going again. And then finally, a few miles down the track, the train stops again, and they're discussing what to do. And Brezhnev says, wait, hold on. And he goes through the train car and he pulls down all the shades. And then he gets done, he comes back and he's like, oh, the train's moving again. So anyway, that's what I have. Thanks for your attention, and I will take limited questions. I've gone on far too long, but thank you for your time.